My name is Tom Lawson. I'm originally from South Africa. I moved to the United States when I was 19 years of age. I did my university work in the United States, and I finally got my PhD at the University of Chicago. And then I started teaching at a university called Western Michigan University, which I taught for many, many years, most probably 120. And then I actually retired in the year 2004, but only in order to start a new job at Queen's University in Belfast with the Institute of Cognition and Culture. And one of the wonderful things is I get invited various places to do things. And LEVYNA at Masaryk University invited me to come here last year, and I enjoyed it so much that I was hoping that somehow or the other they would invite me back, which they did. And so this time they invited me for 4 weeks as a senior scholar in residence. Not a junior, but a senior, because, you know, I've got a gray beard and gray hair. So anyway, that's my background. I'm the author with someone else of a number of books, one called Rethinking Religion, Cognition and Culture. And my major interest is in the cognitive science of religion. A great deal of work in the past in the study of religion has been, for example, historical and philosophical, and to some extent sociological and anthropological. And there was some work even in the psychology of religion. But most of these earliest attempts didn't really get deep enough from the perspective of those who work in the cognitive and the evolutionary sciences. So what we decided to do is to begin to focus more specifically on how the mind works, how the mind produces the kinds of ideas and the forms of behavior that human beings engage in. So in a sense, we have a kind of double method. On the one hand, we use the techniques of cognitive science in order to explain religion, and we also use the techniques of evolutionary psychology to account for how the mind got that way, and on the basis of how the mind got that way, why do human beings behave in the way that they do. And religious behavior is particularly interesting because it doesn't follow our normal forms of behavior. There's always something special, something rather odd about it. And so what we are interested in is finding out, you know, what is odd about it. And whereas all this previous work was there, most of it was actually theoretical. And so at a certain point it became obvious that if you're going to have to make the points that you want to make about religion, you better well engage in experimental work. And one of the great things about what's going on in LEVYNA now is that they've actually focused upon this. So strictly speaking, LEVYNA is one of the first universities to really make a concentrated effort to focus upon experimental issues. The Institute of Cognition and Culture at Queen's University also does that, but I think that they're doing it far more systematically here than they even done it at Queen's University, which I think they're doing good things there. But here, you know, you have a large group of students deeply dedicated to experimental studies, and I think the thing that I appreciate most is the tremendous sense of cooperation that I see between students. Because while students each individually have their own projects, they're also cooperating with each other. And this was most impressive to me, because that's how scientists actually work. Whereas people in the humanities tend to be loners, you know, me against the world. Whereas people who do experimental work together. Well, I think that what the humanities do is something very, very important. What the humanities do is focus upon the kinds of products that the cultural products that humans engage in, you know, works of art, works of whatever human beings do that captures our attention. And I think that the people in the humanities primarily are interested in the significance, the meaning, and the value for human beings. I think what scientists tend to do is they want to explain why people have those values. It's not just accidental that they love some things and not others, okay? And so I think that the scientific approach, it doesn't contradict what's going on at the humanities, but I think it asks different kinds of questions, questions of explanation, whereas a great deal of the humanities focuses upon the interpretation of things. For example, even when you are presented with a religious text, a person in the humanities will look at that text, for example, and try to figure out what it means, what significance it has, what value it has. So whether you're looking at the Kama Sutra or the Old Testament, or the Quran, humanities scholars are primarily concerned with interpretive matters, whereas scientific people are far more interested in the underlying structures, specifically cognitive structures, that can account for how these kinds of values emerge in human society. It's a long story, but I love to tell, my famous story about how I discovered this whole field by accident. During the 60s in the United States, there was a revolution going on, a revolution of the young against the old. It had many dimensions to it. I never forget, for example, the first time I heard the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. This was a tremendously exciting time in my own life because I was just starting teaching at the time. At that point, people used to have cocktail parties and just get drunk. Well, what I did when I became to the university, I invited everyone I knew, faculty, students, and all together, took all the furniture out of my house, got a hi-fi player, and started playing rock and roll music, you see. Well, which was amazing because I even had the mayor of the town dancing, so I became known as the leader. But anyway, during that period, we were also very serious scholars. People forget that you can have fun and do serious things at the same time, And after the assassination of Martin Luther King, there was a very serious problem in the United States. It had been there before, but it was exacerbated by the assassination of Martin Luther King. And I happened to be, even though I was a South African, I happened to become the advisor to the Black Action Movement, whose project at the time was an attempt to blow up the football stadium of the university. And my job was to kind of calm them down and say, look, there are better ways to solve the problem than this. Anyway, one of the black students one day said to me that I should read Noam Chomsky. And so the next time I got the opportunity to find a book by Noam Chomsky, I bought it and read it. And it was a very, very boring book to most people called Syntactic Structures. But to me, it was a very, very exciting book. Because what it did was it showed that languages differed in very, very profound ways across societies and cultures. And nevertheless, Chomsky was able to show that there were underlying principles that, in a sense, explained both the differences and the similarities between languages. This particularly intrigued me because I was interested in the differences among religions. So I said, well, if Chomsky can do this to language, I can do this to religion. Of course, this is a very arrogant thing to say as a young man. But, I began to work on this, and at a certain point I felt that I had come to an understanding of at least some of the principles underlying the variety of religions in the world. And what was particularly important, that at the same time then I began to recognize how important it is to study the mind and the brain. So I began to focus upon how the mind works, and so I began to study the new psychology at the time. Because at that time, the reigning psychology was called behavioral psychology. And what I began to discover was there was a new psychology called cognitive psychology. and also evolutionary psychology, which began to focus much more on the internal operations of our minds. And so I was attempting to show how if we understood how the mind worked, we'd be able to actually understand why there are all these various religions in the world. You know, when I studied, I was alone, and the only people who would listen to me, my students, and they were a captive audience, you know. And so but slowly, people began to graduate, get their PhDs and so forth, and slowly it began to spread. And people who were outside the field began to recognize what was going on inside the field and say, oh, there's something interesting going on. And so from a very, very small beginning, it began to get larger and larger. Organizations began to be formed. For example, in the year 2000, the International Association for the Cognitive Science of Religion was formed. And many people attend this now. We were recently trying to estimate the number of people involved in this. And if you just take faculty members alone, we think there are about 500. So that's from just a few to such a large number is very significant. And of course, if you take the number of students into consideration that are studying the cognitive science of religion, we have really a rather large number. And the exciting thing about this conference is that now, you know, we're having a summit meeting on Saturday, a meeting from Oxford University, the University of British Columbia, the Institute of Cognition and Culture at Queen's University, and LEVYNA right here in this wonderful city of Brno. I think that there'll be a lot of connection between the various institutes, because this is what happens in any scientific discipline, you know, in different centers, because not the same people are studying. So you need to raise the important themes in the discipline. So I think that that there'll be some continuity, but different people in different areas are interested in different things. For example, on the basis of the information that I got last night, it's very, very clear that there's an emphasis, for example, in the University of British Columbia on issues of, say, pro-sociality. And to some extent, that's one of the concerns that we have at LEVYNA itself. But people in other centers, for example, we at the Institute of Cognition and Culture focused far more not on pro-social, at least I didn't focus on pro-sociality as much as the more general notion of, you know, in the way individuals' minds work in the context of a religious system of some kind. I think that the cognitive sciences the cognitive science approach is assumed in all of the disciplines. I think the cognitive science approach is something that's fundamental to all of the disciplines. I think that what the additional factor that's being intruded in, there are two things going on right now that I find very, very interesting. On the one hand, some people are paying far more attention to biology itself. And I think that what they're trying to do is they're trying to connect social facts directly to the biological facts. And I think that there is some value in that, definitely. For example, David Sloan Wilson in the United States of America is trying to show how, on the basis of influence by Durkheim, is trying to show how the social behavior, the behavior in groups of human beings can be explained in terms of biological facts, okay? Cognitive scientists themselves actually think that there's a missing element in this. They think that you can't jump directly from the biological to the social. You need to understand the cognitive mechanisms that intervene between this process. And so I think that both approaches are valuable because each makes different kinds of discoveries. I think that I'm interested in the fact that there are various groups in the Institute. Some, for example, are emphasizing these pro-sociality issues, but there are other people, for example, emphasizing emotional issues. And there's one particular project that's deeply interested in autism. Now, autism is what's known as a defect in the theory of mind. Theory of mind is actually a way of talking about how human beings perceive each other and relate to each other. And evidently autistic people, or at least highly autistic people, have very, very difficult time figuring out what's going on behind your eyes. Or, you know, in a sense, all they have as evidence is the face of the person. Now, normally, you know, if I'm talking to you and I smile like this, then you immediately think, you attribute to me the feeling of happiness. Evidently, autistic people have a very difficult time reading faces, and therefore reading what's going on behind the faces. Well, if this is in fact the case, if people in fact are trying to, are having a difficult time reading faces, then an experimenter is trying to study whether this would affect religious behavior. So people who are autistic, would you expect them to be religious or not? Because part of being religious means, you know, to be able to think that there are hidden agents out there that can affect me for good or ill. But is it the case that they don't have that capacity to think of other people as being capable of intentional action? So that's one aspect. But on the other hand, autistic behavior is also very, very profoundly connected to highly repetitive acts. And so the same question would be whether religious people also, autistic people would be very, very attracted to ritual behavior. So that's a great project that's going on, and I think it's a very significant project, and I think when that project is completed, it'll make an impact in the scientific community. I've had a number of opportunities to teach both seminars, to give public lectures. I've even been invited to Bratislava too, because there's a connection between students in Bratislava who come up here to study. I have been deeply impressed by the students. In fact, I was very, very excited to see the level of competence among students. I didn't know what to expect when I first came anyway, you know. You never know, you might come into a bunch of students, I don't want to study anything. Well, this is not true at all. I discovered that these students were tremendously dedicated to what they're doing, but not only that, highly competent. And they are the kind of students that are willing to acquire whatever knowledge it takes to do the kind of work that they do. And already, even on the undergraduate level, I've met students on the undergraduate level now, because I talked to an undergraduate class the other night, and I was most impressed with those undergraduate students as well. So I've met students at the BA level, the MA level, and the PhD level, and they uniformly impress me. I definitely think in the United Kingdom and in the United States of America, there's definitely a development of the cognitive science of religion. Let's just start with America just for a moment. At America now, every year, the American Academy of Religion meets. That's the largest association of people interested in the study of religion in the United States. And they have something like 8,000 to 10,000 members. And at first, you could never find any discussion of the cognitive science of religion. Now there are panels, a whole number of panels with very, very large crowds attending these discussions. So that's already happening in the United States. I think the same thing is happening in the United Kingdom. For example, I was invited by Bristol University to a 3-day conference, and I was the person to give the final talk, you know, in order to say, you know, you're the old guy that can tell us about the past. And anyway, but at that, I was amazed at the number of people who came to that conference from all kinds of disciplines: philosophy, psychology, history, anthropology, sociology, people who came to that conference in order to discuss issues in the cognitive science of religion. So and furthermore, even outside the specific term cognitive science of religion itself, there are people in other disciplines, like in philosophy, for example, that are beginning to pay attention to what's going on in cognitive science of religion and evaluate the kinds of claims being made in that discipline. The Imre Lakatos, who came from somewhere around here in Eastern Europe, Imre Lakatos made a distinction between progressive and degenerating research programs. In degenerating research programs, people study less and less and less and less until there's nothing left to study. And in progressive research programs, people are studying more and more and more and more, you know, it becomes more and more specialized. I think that's clearly the future of the cognitive science of religion. I think it's going to branch into many areas. I'd like to mention just one. One of the important contributions that the cognitive science of religion can make would be to governments who have to deal with cross-cultural issues, and especially when religion is involved in these various cultures. I think there's not sufficient understanding at the government level, and this includes the United States, of the religions of other people. And I think that cognitive science of religion can make a fundamental importance to policy decisions.